Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com, and this is my presentation of the history of economic thought, the ideas that change the world. Now, the purpose of this presentation is to, one, introduce you to many of the names and ideas that permeated throughout the history of economics. Now, I'm going to go over almost 100 different economists and philosophers and other important economic thinkers throughout this presentation. So, in that case, I'm not going to have much time to really dedicate to every single idea that each of these people contributed, and to dedicate as much time as I'd like to the ideas that really make up this economic timeline. More so, the purpose of this presentation is to make sure that you're aware of these names, what some of their main contributions were, and if you find any of these names interesting, to go learn about their other contributions to other areas such as philosophy, mathematics, etc., and to get you interested in the subject of economic thought. Okay, now there's several books that talk about the history of economic thought, and here's a list of many of those books. So if you want, you can pause it, write down some of these. Actually, if you go to learneconomicsnow.com, when I read 50 Major Economists by Stephen Pressman, I actually literally did a video for each chapter as I read through the book. So if you want, I would recommend reading that book, and you can watch those videos as sort of a guide to get my take on a lot of those chapters. And pretty much all the rest of these books are all great books. Many of them I've read or are going to read. I'm especially looking forward to, at some point, getting to The Clash of Economic Ideas by Lawrence H. White and Keynes versus Hayek by Nicholas Wapshott, which both I haven't read yet, but I'm definitely looking forward to it. Okay, so we're going to start off with ancient Athens and some of the thinkers back in the Athenian era of things. Okay, we're going to start off with a guy by the name of Xenophon. Okay, now Xenophon was a philosopher, one of the earliest philosophers, but mainly what I talk about here is that he wrote one of the earliest economic texts in existence, and the focus of that text was mainly household management. A lot of the earlier economic ideas were always about sort of how to manage your economic household, to pay the bills, save money, and manage your life day to day. Okay, and basically the premise of Xenophon's work, which becomes a heavily taught text up to a certain point, talks about moderation and hard work. So the idea is you work hard, get what you can, and make sure not to use all of it, because if not, then your household will fall apart. And other Athenians, and these are also famous philosophers that philosophize on all sorts of things as far as the structure of society, etc., include Plato, okay? And particularly his book, The Republic, that really talked about how society should be organized. And it's in this book where he really starts to talk about the initial ideas about democratic and republican forms of government. And in the Heart of Economics is one of the earliest texts that talk about the idea of specialization, which is the idea that if people specialize in what they're good at, and everybody does what they're good at, we'll actually have more stuff, because the person who's good at making shoes will be able to make more shoes than someone who isn't, and the person who's better at painting will be able to paint more than someone who isn't. So that way everyone should specialize in different tasks instead of everyone having to learn how to do everything. In response to that, there was Politics by Aristotle. Okay, and this is a work by Aristotle where he criticized many of Plato's ideas, especially regarding how society should be run and the different forms of government. Okay, and in this is one of the earlier texts to talk about private property rights and the incentives, and being very sort of pro-private property, and recognizing the role of private property in a society functioning. Then we bring ourselves to the Middle Ages and the thought of the Middle Ages. There was a lot of philosophers. Because at this point, economics isn't in its own idea or its own branch, per se, or own line of academic thought. It's really, at this point, still a branch within philosophy. So, in the sense of people philosophizing about the way the world works and how life should be lived, etc., economic ideas are sort of tied up in there at this point in time. Okay? Now, Thomas Aquinas, who was a theologian and did a lot to talk about sort of ethics and religion and whatnot, one of the things that he talked about in an economic sense was the idea of a just price, which is still an idea that permeates a lot of thinkers today, in the sense that there's a price that necessarily isn't a profit maximizing price, but a price where you're maximizing the value to everybody that's also just and ethical. Okay? And basically, basic idea is you take the cost of whatever it takes to make the good, plus whatever it takes to pay the people who made the good, and that's pretty much it. Okay, so this is sort of a very this is the kind of ideas that later on would take a Marxian take, in a sense where basically surplus profit, stuff like that. But here they call it the just price, and anything you priced above that just price, even if it was more profitable and you were able to charge that price and people would be willing to pay it, you are acting in an unjust way. Now, in response to that was Duns Scotus, who made the counter argument. Basically, one arguing that determining what a just price is a difficult matter, and in that if a person is willing to transact with you at a higher price, it's just by the mere fact that it was voluntary, because both parties are better off, because the only reason you would enter a voluntary transaction is if what you got in return was better than what you were giving up, or else you would have just kept what you had and chose not to participate in that transaction. So in that case, he was making the argument that merchants were sort of benefiting the people that were trading with them, and that the merchant class was generally a good thing, and not something to be necessarily chastised in the same way that Thomas Aquinas did with his ideas of a just price. Then we get to mercantilism. Now, mercantilism is a branch, an early school of economics, and a school, think of it as like a branch of where different economists think of a similar idea. In mercantilism, the idea is to acquire money, okay? So the idea is that you want, for a country to be strong, you need to make stuff and sell it to everybody else. People in the country shouldn't necessarily really be eating the stuff, because we need to sell to everybody else so that we can accumulate a lot of money. And these days it was gold. So the idea is if you can accumulate a lot of gold, then a country can become very powerful. Okay? So you got Thomas Mann, one of the earliest mercantilists. Okay, and basically, as I mentioned before, theorized that a country must export more than it imports to remain prosperous, and advocated for policy pushing frugality and land utilization, meaning basically he wanted governments to make sure that people within the country didn't necessarily use as much stuff, so that we could sell more to other countries and acquire more gold, and said that, policy should also push to make sure that every piece of land is being used all the time, so that way there's more stuff to sell to other countries. Then there's Philipp von Hörnigk. Okay, you see, I couldn't pronounce it as well as I'd like, but he was a German supporter of mercantilism, and he outlined in his work 9 principles of sound economy. Okay, which included things like being against imports, so basically preventing people from selling goods to your country, but selling goods to other countries. Okay, again, cultivating all land, just kind of we saw with Thomas Mann, hoarding gold, and other recommendations. So again, the big theme here with mercantilism is sell a bunch of stuff to everybody else, but then whatever you get, don't use it to buy anything else. So it's all about hoarding. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, or Colbert, advocated the hoarding of gold. Okay, again, common theme here with the mercantilist. Except he went a step farther, and this is in France, formed guilds to run many of France's major industries, which stood in place until the French Revolution. So to help control industry, he formed sort of these, think of guilds as sort of the unions of the Middle Ages. So they'd be organizations that would help a particular industry sort of organize itself and prevent outside competition so they can charge higher prices and whatnot. Now, what happens that a very mysterious guy by the name of Richard Cantillon, he mysteriously writes the first economic treatise. Now, the life of Richard Cantillon is a very interesting one because we don't know much about it, and there's even theories about that he faked his death, and the thing is that there's nothing else written by Richard Cantillon because technically he supposedly died in this fire, well, all of his work got burnt. Now, copies of Richard Cantillon's texts would float around and influence many of the economic thinkers going forward, and this was really the first time that you really have a body of text that it summarizes the entire economy as a whole and talks about how everything works from bottom to top. Okay, and he also talks about things like, when there's an influx of money that you don't really know where it's going to go, and this becomes known as a Cantillon effect. The idea is that if new money enters an economy, that it'll begin to increase prices, but which prices go up first, you don't know. You'll learn that along the way. And one of the things that text expires is the British Enlightenment, okay, among one of the many different movements. So here you have a lot of philosophers who not only talk about economic ideas, but ideas of liberty and freedom, And this will lead to, again, a lot of the ideas that lead to things like the physiocrats, Adam Smith, etc. Okay, here you have John Locke, who critiqued much of absolutism of Tom Hobbes. So Thomas Hobbes said, like, there's objective reality and truth and whatnot, and John Locke would criticize some of those ideas. Okay, developed the idea of the social contract. So Hobbes and Locke were both sort of in this debate about what is a social contract and different definitions of social contract. And John Locke, the way he kind of theorized it, is people will enter this sort of social contract not for some sort of social order, but more for like common defense of property. So the purpose of the government should be to defend one's property. And this is where he came up with ideas for that would later end up with different ideas of taxation. So if I remember, John Locke said the idea was you should have progressive taxation. The reason is if government's role is to protect property, those with the most property should pay the most taxes because they're getting the most service. But that's essentially the role that government plays, or a state plays, that of protecting property of those who've sort of delegated it that authority. And considered one of the grandest fathers of classical liberalism, and nowadays usually would refer to classical liberalism as libertarianism. Then there's Dudley North, who argued against mercantilist ideas, and basically saying that constantly having a trade surplus wasn't necessarily a good thing. Meaning constantly selling stuff to other people isn't a good thing, because if you're not also getting stuff, then the people in the country aren't necessarily better off. And talked about the benefits of free trade and government non-interfering in trade to allow everybody to get the things that they want, because if everyone gets the things that they want, then they're better off. So yes, you want to sell stuff, but you also want to buy stuff to make your life better off. And at the end of the day, that's really the end goal, to make your life better off. And this is kind of where Dudley North was going. Then there's David Hume. He agreed with North that trade should not be interfered with, but he also argued that a trade surplus would lead to an increase in gold and silver, resulting in price inflation. So the idea is if you're selling a lot of goods to other countries, you'll end up having a lot of gold entering the country, and that'll cause prices to push up because you have an influx of money. Okay? So it's not necessarily a good thing, because you don't want to necessarily cause that inflation. So again, you want balanced trade, so that way there aren't necessarily you don't want to trade deficit, but you don't want to trade surplus. You want balanced trade, so that way prices aren't necessarily being messed up along the way. Now, Hume was also a major contributor and probably more well known for a lot of his work regarding morality, ethics, etc. Then there's Francis Hutchinson, who was a teacher of Adam Smith, one of the who we'll be going into next. And also he was one of the last few scholars to really teach Xenophon's work from earlier. So about household management and managing your household and hard work and moderation and all that stuff. At this point, a lot of that earlier economic ideas, what's going to happen is that Adam Smith will come out with like the Wealth of Nations and the theory of multiple sentiments, and a lot of those will begin to become the center of economic thinking and economic ideas going forward, because everything up to this point really kind of gets summarized in Adam Smith's work. But before we get to Adam Smith, we'll get to the physiocrats, which is a French school of economics, and one of the earliest like real formal schools where you really had a formal group of economists that sort of associated themselves with one particular person's work and really built upon it. And that person was Francois Quesnay. He wrote the Tableau Economique. And the thing that made the physiocrats is that they had a huge thing for land. Okay, they felt that land was the only productive asset, and basically everything else was just a transformation of what land created. So basically, a table, all you did is you took stuff that land created, the trees that grew from the land, the crops, etc., and transformed it into other goods. So the only thing that really makes new stuff is land. Thus, economic ideas should be centered around land. Okay, and basically theorize about the productivity of land and the net product of land. It says only that net product of land, basically the profit or the extra profit you get after on the final goods, should be taxed. Okay, so this is not, you don't tax it when you take the wood and sell it to the wood maker, and then tax it again when the wood maker sells the planks of wood to the carpenter, who then takes the wood and then builds a cabinet out of it. You would tax it after the carpenter sells the cabinet, because that would be the net product of the land. Anne-Robert-Jacques Turgot, okay, he developed many of the ideas of Francois Quesnay, so he took what Quesnay was doing and kind of went further with it. In his work, he divided people into three classes. It was the landowners, who owned that productive asset, the agricultural class, who would cultivate that productive asset, and the salaried class, who basically got paid all along the rest of the way in production. And said only the new product of land should be taxed, okay, or the net product of land, and argued for economic freedom. So again, the physiocrat school was also a very early proponent of classical liberalism, for freedom, less government, etc. Now we get to the classical economists. So again, you had the work of Richard Cantillon, you had the works of the physiocrats, and at this point they all influence Adam Smith, and Adam Smith writes two books, The Wealth of Nations and The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Now, The Wealth of Nations focus more on the benefits of trade, okay, and why when people are free to trade with each other, people are better off. While The Theory of Moral Sentiments was more about ethics and how we develop our moral sentiments, the way we look at the world and decide what's wrong and good. And really, to understand Adam Smith, you really need to look at both works, because they both are complementary in seeing Adam Smith's point of view of the world. Now, he had other work. He wrote all sorts of stuff, but most people never got to see that work, because before he died, he asked someone, when he dies, just burn it, because he didn't want people to see unfinished work. It took him years to write the works he did put out. Okay, he was quite reclusive. Then you have Walter Bagehot, okay, who basically, he wrote about the UK Constitution. So the United Kingdom has kind of, at this point, when Walter Bagehot was alive, had established its constitution. And he would write about the tensions between social institutions and innovations, in the sense that innovations would outpace social institutions, and this would cause tension, and this was kind of it's innovation that would force society to move forward, in a sense. Okay, and he also wrote a lot about central banks, which is probably what he's best known for. The idea that, he wasn't necessarily a big proponent of central banking, or he was, a lot of his ideas is what influences a lot of what you call free bankers, people who believe that the banking system should just be free of government intervention. And basically said, well, in that case, if you have a central bank, what you should do is that during a time of crisis, central banks should lend freely on good collateral. So that means that the collateral, banks can put up decent assets, like good quality assets, up as collateral. The central bank should lend to them, but they should lend to them at interest rates that are punitive, meaning that hurt. Okay, so that way next time around, they don't make the same mistakes again. Now, how we've kept up with that sense, and central bankers, have they actually lent on good collateral or at punitive rates, that is up for debate. But it was Bagehot's ideas that sort of really set what central bankers should be doing, okay? Helping institutions with good collateral that are just having a rough time get through, but with some pain. Then there's Jeremy Bentham. Now, Jeremy Bentham is probably most famous for developing the idea of utilitarianism, meaning that the ethical choice is whatever provides the most good for the most people. Okay, he was also an atheist, a prison reformer, an animal rights activist. Okay, he did not like suffering. Okay, and utilitarian ideas are still very popular to an extent. But there's still a lot of philosophical controversiality over utilitarianism, because, for example, a common dilemma presented in philosophy is like you have 10 people on a boat, okay, but the boat will sink if all 10 people stay on the boat, okay. Now, basically, one person needs to be thrown off. Now, how do you decide who that person is? Now, yes, throwing that one person off is the utilitarian decision. It maximizes the most good for the most people, because if all 10 people stay in the boat, they all die. But if one of them is thrown off, then the 9 survive and 1 dies. So in that scenario, you've maximized good for the most amount of people. But again, for that individual who's being thrown off the boat, does that mean it's necessarily unethical for him to prevent himself from being thrown off the boat? Okay, so these are the kind of ethical quandaries that are brought up through the idea of utilitarianism that are constantly being hashed out by philosophers. And overall, Jeremy Bentham was what you would, well, a lot of, if you ever hear someone call themselves a technocrat or a pragmatist, they would probably be very big into utilitarianism, meaning they're not necessarily stuck on any particular set of policies or way the world has to work. They just want the world to work whatever way it takes to make it the best, work for the most amount of people most of the time. That would be sort of your typical technocrat or pragmatist, trying to just make it work for everybody as much as possible, despite any ethical conflicts otherwise. Then there's Jean-Baptiste Say. He developed Say's law. The idea is that production equals demand, so there cannot be a glut of supply. What it really means is that supply creates its own demand. So if I make something, people will eventually want it. I just got to find the price that someone will want it at. So in that case, there can never be too much stuff. It's just maybe there's too much stuff at too high a price. Okay, and believe in the neutrality of money. So this is one of the first people to really talk about the neutrality of money. The idea behind the neutrality of money is that the quantity of money doesn't matter. If there's more money, prices will just go up. If there's less money, prices will just go down. So in itself, the quantity of money doesn't matter, at least to anyone who believes the neutrality of money. Again, that's still to this day one of those ideas that economists argue heavily about. Thomas Malthus. Now, Thomas Malthus was an economist who was very pessimistic, let's put it that way. What he believed is that the economy can never, or human condition can never improve. Why? Because even when humanity can figure out a way to become prosperous, what will happen is that this will lead to more leisure time, and more leisure time will lead to more child rearing. So then there'll be more people, and then the extra stuff that you got from being more prosperous is now gone because you got so many extra people. And this made more sense during Thomas Malthus's time because technology wasn't advancing as quick as it is now. So in this case, it was very visible to see that people would always stay at what's called subsistence, which means making just enough to get by. Okay, and things would only improve for short periods of time and then go back to where they were. Now, as time has gone on, the growth of innovation and technology has now, for the most part, heavily outpaced population growth and the trend back to subsistence. So a lot of Malthus' ideas are a lot more in contention. But because of that, at that time, he advocated, basically, he was against welfare because he felt that if the government assisted the poor, then they would have more kids. So he didn't want them to assist the poor. But he also believed in protectionism, that the government should try to make sure that people within that country are doing well, even if it's at the cost of other people's countries, because again, either the people in your country do well or everybody suffers. Okay, so you might as well at least do the best you can for the people within your borders. Okay, and he critiques Say's law. Okay, and it was his critique of Say's law that would be the impetus for people like Keynes and lots of others down the road. Like Thomas Malthus was one of the many big thinkers that influenced Keynes in the way he thinks, as when we talk about John Maynard Keynes down the road. David Ricardo, he developed the idea of the theory of comparative advantage. Okay, this is the idea of not absolute advantage. So absolute advantage would be the person who absolutely has the best ability to build X good should build it. Comparative advantage is every country should, or everyone should always focus on making what they can make the best. Okay? Because if you can make it the best, then you can make a little bit more, which means there'll be more available for everybody. And if all countries traded with each other, and they freely traded with each other, and made what they were best at, there'd be more for everybody. He also developed the theory of rents, which is the idea that as land gets cultivated, rents will be pushed up, and that'll create an incentive to cultivate the lower yielding land. So basically, land that's not so good will begin, the rent on it will be so low compared to the raising rents on developed land that people will then pay to develop the lower yielding land. So overall, as rents go up, the rents of all lands go up because as rents go up on the top land, people will cultivate the lower land, raising that rent as well. John Stuart Mill. Okay, for the most part, he wrote one of the textbooks that was really used as the primary introductory economic textbook up until Paul Samuelson wrote his textbook. I think his textbook was called Principles of Economics. Most economics textbooks are called Principles of Economics, but particularly Paul Samuelson's textbook becomes the new primary textbook. But before then, John Stuart Mill's textbook was the primary one. He was one of the first people to talk about supply and demand as ideas and opportunity costs. Okay, so again, supply meaning the amount of goods that are available, demand, the amount that people want those goods, and opportunity costs, which you give up by making a decision. So for example, if I choose to go right, if I have the choice between going right and left, and I choose to go right, my opportunity cost is anything I would have gone if I had went left. Okay, so the cost of the choice you didn't make. Okay, then there's Marxism. Now, what happens is that Karl Marx ends up on the scene, and he ends up talking about economic ideas and criticizing what's known as capital. Well, he terms as capitalism. The term capitalism was actually made by Marx, and it was actually a pejorative term, meaning a negative term, for free markets per se. And he would argue that yes, free markets and free trade does increase the speed of innovation and will improve people's quality of lives for a period of time, but over time that there would be people who would sort of own all capital, like who would own all the factories, own all the companies, own everything worth owning. Okay, and they'll be to the point where basically people who work for them have to work for a lot less than necessarily what they're contributing to the process of production. And this difference would be called exploitation. So if you're saying if they're basically, if people are being paid less than their contribution, they're being exploited. Now, how do you actually really come up with that? How much that contribution really is? That's an economic debate as long as the day. But he was also a big fan of Hegel, who was a philosopher. And Hegel will always talk about conflicts and how change is brought in through conflict. So as time goes on, conflicts arise, and from that conflict, something new. So he would talk about how eventually capitalism would lead to two classes. The capitalist class, which are the people who own the factories, who own business, the titans of industry. And the labor class, which are the people who worked for them. And eventually the exploitation would get so bad that there would be a conflict between these two classes, and the resulting society that quelches that conflict is socialism. Okay, and again, Marx went into some detail, but didn't fill in all the blanks about what he meant by communism and socialism and all that stuff. This would be, a lot of people would end up trying to fill those blanks, like Lenin, Mao, Stalin, etc., Castro, later on. Okay, and to this day, there's people who are still trying to sort of take the ideas that Marx laid out and take them further. Okay, and at this point, you're still using what's called the labor theory, or he established what's called the labor theory of value. The idea is that labor is a pretty big component, if not most, of what the value of a good. Okay, and it's later on you'll see that we kind of get away from that. It's really at the marginal revolution later on when you start coming up with Karl Menger's subjective value theory that you really begin moving away from that labor theory of value. Okay, what happens next? Okay, now the marginal revolution, what happened here is you had three different economists all come up with the idea of marginal analysis at the same time. Okay, now the idea behind marginal analysis is that you don't treat all units as uniform goods. So for example, the value of every slice of pizza, of one piece of pizza, is not the same. I'm going to enjoy the first slice of pizza a lot. The second slice of pizza I'm still going to enjoy it, but probably not as much as the first slice of pizza. So even though they're the identical good, the value they provide me is different. Okay? And then maybe the third slice of pizza I'll enjoy, but and in the fourth pizza, I've now eaten too much, and now I have a negative utility or negative benefit from eating that slice of pizza. So that would be sort of a basic marginal analysis. But anytime you take any sort of economic concept and sit there and say, okay, well, if we add one more, is that still a good thing, or is that now a bad thing? That's marginal analysis. So three economists came up with this whole idea of marginal analysis at the same time. It was Leon Walras. Okay, was one of the three economists that discovered the theory of marginal utility at the same period of time. He was father of what's called the Lausanne School of thought. Okay, and basically this is a very mathematics-focused school of economics. Okay, and he was the originator of what's called general equilibrium theory. This is the idea that prices trend towards a equilibrium price. So the way this would work is, for example, if I'm selling bananas and I set the bananas at a X price, okay, if the price is too high, what's going to happen is that no one's going to buy the bananas, so I'll end up with too many bananas. And I'll have a surplus, so next time I'll lower the price. Now, if I lower the price too much, I'll sell out of the bananas too fast, and I'll still have a bunch of people who want bananas. I'll have a shortage. So through this sort of trial and error process, the economy gets to equilibrium. The other way you can get there is through an auction, because you'll have people who are bidding high, people who are bidding low, and eventually you'll find the clearing price at which an auction clears. Okay, but either way, prices trend towards equilibrium. Okay, and he got into a lot of trying to mathematically figure out how you get there. Then there was Karl Menger, who was sort of the founder of the Austrian School of Economics. Now, his major contribution is probably, to me, one of the most important contributions in all of economics, is the idea of subjective value. The idea that there is, like, a slice of pizza has no objective value. It's what I think it's worth. It's what it's worth to me. Okay, so for you might think that pizza's worth $5. I think it's only worth $3. Okay, so when I try to sell it to you for $3.50, you're more than glad to pay it, and I'm more than glad to sell it to you because I'm selling it to you for more than I think it's worth, and you're buying it for less than you think it's worth. So we both win. Okay, and that's an important idea because that solves a lot of the conundrums about why things like diamonds, which have no real practical use, would be worth more than something like bread, which has, you need it to survive for the most part. Okay, so that was a major breakthrough. Then there was Stanley Jevons, okay, who again also developed marginal ideas, and again same thing. He was the father of the Cambridge School of Economics. Again, many economists also developing on the ideas of Stanley Jevons in particular. And he developed what's called the Jevons paradox. Okay, the idea that increased efficiency leads to increased use. This is an idea that's very important to environmental economics, in the sense that, for example, you develop a more fuel-efficient car. Well, that means you won't use as much gas to travel a farther distance, so people actually end up driving more because they'll go on more road trips since it's cheaper to go on a road trip. Okay, and you'll actually end up with much more car use. Or at the same time, it'll be much more affordable to have a car, so people who wouldn't have had a car otherwise will begin having cars, and basically increased efficiency actually results in increased use of the good. That's what's the Jevons paradox. He also created the first business cycle theory, which is based on sunspots, the idea that the sun moves around and will affect crop yields, and that's sort of what affects the business cycle. So when the sun is in the right place and you have huge crop yields, that'll lead to the boom, but then when the sun's in a different place and crop yields are low, you end up with a bust. So now we'll take a look at each of these economists of the Marginal Revolution, Walras, Menger, and Jevons. Each of them sort of started a school of economic thought that came out after them. So we'll discuss each of these a little bit. So first it was the Lausanne School, again after Leon Walras. These ideas, and again, a lot of these economists really focus on math and developing mathematical ideas, etc. There was Vilfredo Pareto. Okay, he developed the idea of Pareto optimality. This is the idea that when the economy is in a condition where no person, okay, can be made worse off without making somebody else worse off, that's Pareto optimal. So if you're in a situation and you can make someone better off and everybody's better off, then you're not at Pareto optimality yet. Okay? You're at Pareto optimality once, again, you're as good as you can get. The only way I can make X person better by making Y person worse. he criticized democracy and argued for a minimal state to limit the power of any emergent ruling class. He was very afraid that the democratic process would get usurped, corrupted, etc. And a lot of people thought of him as a totalitarian for criticizing democracy, but he didn't. But again, more he was criticizing the ability for democracy to stay, to maintain its integrity over time. Okay, and those are generally things that pan out. So for the most part, I think that's panned out. The Vienna Austrian School. Okay, for those who know me as a libertarian and an economics junkie, I am a big fan of the Austrian school. But let's talk about this. And again, this developed on Karl Marx's work. Now, the next economist in line is a guy by the name of Eugen Böhm-Bawerk. And this guy is extremely important because there's really two things that he really contributes. One is the capital theory. Basically, the idea here is mostly focusing on the roundaboutness of the structure of production. So the idea is, as innovation happens, people get further and further away. So for example, if I wanted to create a chair, okay, if I had to actually cut down the tree, make the wood, and then make a chair, that would be much more difficult. Okay, it would take me, it's a much simpler process of production, but it's much more difficult, and it's a lot less efficient. Now, as the production process gets more complex, it actually gets more efficient, okay, the longer the chain goes. Because what if you had this process? Instead of someone just cutting down wood, and then just turning the wood into a chair, someone had to cut down the wood, send it to a plant to get processed, and they where they sat down and chopped the uniform size blocks, and then they had to ship it over to a warehouse, and where the manufacturer would then sell it in different stores called Home Depot. And you would go there, you'll actually be able to buy the wood for a lot cheaper. It's a much more efficient process. So as the more roundabout the production process gets, the more efficient it gets, and the more yield you get. Okay. Also, he introduced the idea of intemporal thinking. So we're talking about how the economy doesn't necessarily, it's not always talking about what's the economy doing now. So a lot of times economists will talk about if something's not being used now, then that's a problem. But you take the way Eugen Böhm-Bawerk and how Austrians would think from here on out, if someone decides not to use something right now, maybe it's because they want to use it sometime in the future. And you start thinking about how the economy allocates those resources over time. And that's a very important contribution to the way we think about economics. He also criticized a lot of the ideas of Marx. Okay, so Böhm-Bawerk made extreme contributions to the field of economics, and sometimes a lot of people feel that his work is very underappreciated. If you're an economics student, you should definitely go back and read some of his work. It's some pretty insightful stuff. Then there was Freidrich von Wieser. Okay, and he began the economic calculation debate. This was the debate with socialists or Marxists about, can socialism work? But instead of making the incentive debate, which was the argument that in a communist world there wasn't an incentive for people to work, they were making the argument that a communist society, since they don't have market prices because everything is sort of centrally planned, that they won't have the information to figure out how much of X and Y and Z good to make, so thus socialism couldn't work. Now, also participating in this debate was Ludwig von Mises and F.A. Hayek, who made important contributions in this debate with socialism. And again, the focus of this debate is the importance of prices and how prices act as a transmission mechanism, so that way people in the economy know how much to make, what to make, etc. He also stressed the importance of entrepreneurs, and it was a lot of his work on entrepreneurs that Joseph Schumpeter would take on and sort of develop from there. And he coined the term opportunity cost. So the first time the actual term opportunity cost was used was really by Friedrich von Wieser. Then there's Joseph Schumpeter. Now, Joseph Schumpeter is probably the most famous of the Vienna School. And basically, he continued the work of entrepreneurs, talking about how entrepreneurs really drive the economy. And this is where you get the term creative destruction. He talked about innovation as a this equilibrating force, meaning in the sense that an economy trends towards equilibrium, as we talked about before. But eventually, once it hits equilibrium, the economy kind of stagnates. It doesn't go any further because it's at equilibrium. So an innovation, or some sort of technological innovation, process innovation, something of that sort, what it does, it throws the whole thing out of whack. Okay? And what happens now, the economy has to find a new equilibrium. So which means certain businesses can't exist, new businesses have to arise, and this is what's called the creative destruction. As we create new technologies, they destroy old businesses, and new businesses are creating their wake, and that's how society actually progresses. Okay, so the society trends towards equilibrium, but you need to disturb that equilibrium through innovation to sort of move forward. And then he had some interesting ideas on business cycles. He took a lot of different ideas that other people have done on business cycles and started saying, you know what, maybe there isn't one business cycle. Maybe there's several different cycles that occur at different frequencies for different reasons. He created a taxonomy saying there's like short-term, I think the short-term ones were the jugular cycles, and the really, really long ones were the Kondratiov wave, what they would call a Kondratiov wave. And this had to do with technology and huge spurts of innovation. He was a critic of Keynes. Pretty much everyone in the Vienna School all were big fans of critiquing Marx and Keynes. And he theorized, Schumpeter, that capitalism would also die in the same way that Marx did. The difference is, it wasn't because it was a conflict. Schumpeter theorized that what would happen is that capitalism would be so successful that people would have so much leisure time that you would have a bunch of academics sitting around who would find ways to complain about capitalism, and that would be the end of it, because people would sit there and consume their work, and they would be convinced that capitalism is a bad idea, and they'll try something else to everyone's detriment. Okay, and that's Joseph Schumpeter. He's a fairly interesting guy. He's had some funny quotes. There's one about him and a horse that I can't really remember right now, but it's pretty funny. Look it up. Ludwig von Mises, okay, another really, really fascinating economist who contributed a whole lot. He helped develop what's called the Austrian business cycle theory. Basic idea is this: you expand credit, so usually through an expansion of the money supply, but now there's more credit than naturally would be, because usually credit, meaning being able to borrow money from the bank, would usually come from people saving. But if it comes from because you just gave the banks free money because you printed more money, what happens is that the interest rate or the level of credit in the economy doesn't reflect the actual amount of savings in the economy, and this causes entrepreneurs and investors to allocate their funds, so they misallocate or malinvest their funds in the wrong projects, usually taking on sort of longer term investment projects, something like putting on an expansion to a restaurant or building a house or starting a whole new sort of chain of business, and they put the money towards a wrong investment. Now, since they're long-term investments, it'll take a long time before you realize it's the wrong place to put it. Meanwhile, in the moment that you're employing those assets, you're employing people, etc., and this causes a boom in the economy, and the economy seems a lot bigger than it is. But when it turns out that a lot of those projects that fueled that growth weren't sustainable, you end up having a bust on the other side. Okay? He also wrote the Economic Treatise, another book that sort of explained the economy from head to toe, called Human Action. Okay, it's a pretty big tome, and it's a pretty intense read since it was translated, but it's definitely worth your time if you ever want to give it a shot. He was a major critic of socialism, okay, and he contributed to the economic calculation debate, as we mentioned earlier. He also founded the Mont Pelerin Society with Hayek, Popper, Steeler, and Milton Friedman. Okay, which is basically the society of like economists that really try to push the ideas of free markets and free people, classical liberalism. Then there's F.A. Hayek, Friedrich von Hayek. Now, he helped develop even further the work of the Austrian business cycle theory that Mises started, and he would discuss the natural rate of interest and its effect on the structure of production. And basically the idea is that if government policy pushed the prevailing interest rates below what would naturally be the natural interest rate, this would create the same phenomenon of malinvestment that we discussed in the previous section. Some of the important terms that were really contributed by Hayek were terms like spontaneous order or emergent order. The idea that you don't need people to centrally plan a society or to make society work, to have order. That order just naturally emerges. People just naturally organize themselves. Okay, and this is visible in the way free markets, and you take a look at any industry and how things have occurred. Like, no one had to organize the cell phone industry for it to turn out the way it did. In most industries, the way it did. And other examples is like in England, they took out all the road signs in some town somewhere. And what happened is that instead of having more accidents, you actually had less accidents because people just started coordinating with each other more. And he developed a lot of philosophical work on liberalism and on choice, like the Constitution of Liberty. He did a lot of work on the legal system and law and how law should be. So he was a very prolific writer, wrote a lot of good stuff. And again, if you have the time, you should definitely check out his work. Then there's the Cambridge School. Okay, you have Alfred Marshall. He was the first person to really create a supply and demand curve chart. So those little charts that you learn when you first get into economics, you can thank Alfred Marshall for that. So basically all the graphing and all that stuff was really sort of thanks to Alfred Marshall. He's the kind of guy who got that all started. And again, his books are pretty important when it comes to general equilibrium analysis. So again, that came from Walras and Jevons and all that stuff. Okay, then you had Cecil Pigou. Now, Pigou's really famous for his ideas regarding externalities. Now, externalities, if you're not familiar with them, are the effects on third parties of your action. So, for example, a negative externality would be like if I decide not to take a shower and I go on the train and everyone has a much worse ride because of my choice, that would be a negative externality. They, out of no choice of their own, suffered. A positive externality is if I took a really good, thorough shower and everyone enjoyed that I smelled very good while I was on the train, and I made their trip much more pleasant for it. Okay, and basic Cecil Pigou was the government should penalize negative externalities by taxing them, and should subsidize positive externalities by either subsidies or tax cuts or etc. Okay, and these are very popular ideas, and a lot of his work is extremely instrumental in the ideas of like welfare and environmental economics, where externalities play a big role. So the idea is that you have a positive externality out of helping the poor, because if the poor don't get so desperate, there'll be less crime. Okay, or there's a positive externality out of helping the environment, because then people have less health problems due to the environment. So you have those positive externalities, and the government should subsidize those. That's sort of the argument in welfare and environmental economics. Later on, an economist by Ralph Coase, who I'll mention much further on, he sort of criticizes the idea, saying that it's not necessarily always the best choice for government to get involved by subsidizing and penalizing. Maybe it's good to just let the negative and positive externalities work themselves out naturally, because then people will come up with sort of interesting new ways that we might not have thought of to deal with those things. Okay, now here's a couple other economists that you should be aware of during this period of time, such as Irving Fisher. Now, Irving Fisher, probably most famous for his theory of debt deflation. Okay, this is the idea that the reason the economy falls down or has a bust is because it's accumulated too much debt. And what happens is that as people decide to start paying down that debt, that causes less activity, which causes drops in asset prices, which causes more debt problems, and you end up with what's called a deflationary spiral. He was also the originator of the equation of exchange, which is MV equals PQ, which stands for the money supply times the velocity of money, meaning the amount of times that the money kind of moves around, equals the price of all goods sold times the quantity of all goods sold. Okay? And this really didn't go anywhere with Irving Fisher, but later on Milton Friedman kind of brings it back, and it becomes mainly associated with Milton Friedman and monetarism. John Maynard Keynes, probably one of the most influential, if not the most influential economist of the last 100 years. Okay, and probably there's two economists that every undergraduate will learn about before they graduate, it'll be Adam Smith and John Maynard Keynes. Those will probably be the two names they walk away from. He is the father of what's called the Keynesian school of economics. He coined terms like the paradox of thrift, which is the idea, not that it's bad to save, I think that's a misconception, but the idea is that if everybody saved at the same time, that would be a bad thing. If everybody was prudent at the same time, was basically his point, it would be a bad thing. Because if all of us were to stop spending money, then there would be no one to, there would be no transactions. The economy would literally just halt. The economy depends on there being savers and spenders, because for people to save, there has to be someone spending money with them. And they also talk about liquidity traps. These were times when if you were to print money to get the economy out of a glut. So the idea is that if the economy was uncompetitive because people were getting paid too much, it's kind of hard to give them a pay cut. So one way you can give them a pay cut without asking them is to print more money and cause inflation. So then their pay is worth less, and that can make the economy competitive again. The problem is, if people don't spend that money that you print to push prices up, then you don't get the inflation you need to get the economy competitive again. So when you have a situation like that, that's what Keynes would refer to as a liquidity trap, and argue that government should be sort of actively spending in all of that. Then there's Simon Kuznets. Simon Kuznets came up with some pretty interesting things, such as he's the guy who actually developed national income accounting. So numbers like GDP, GNP that we use today in economics were designed by him originally in 1934. He was also the originator of an idea called the Kuznets curve. And basically, the Kuznets curve, as he originally formulated it, was more about inequality, in the sense that a country will develop, at first, inequality will increase as the economy develops, because you have a lot more risk taking, and you have a lot more institutions that are just developing, and people who have access to those institutions. But as the economy develops, the inequality will begin to decrease, because then people will have much more power to start asking for more, and it'll just naturally, go around. People have tried to apply this to like environmental economics, and the same idea saying that the environment will get worse before it gets better. So when the economy develops, you'll have a worse environment, but then as the economy really develops, people will begin to buy things that are much more environmentally safer, and you'll have sort of the opposite turnaround. Then there's G.F. Knapp, or Nape. He was the father of what's called the Chartist school of economics, which is not now commonly known as the modern monetary theory. And he wrote a book called The State Theory of Money. So if you're not familiar with what modern monetary theory is, basically, if you ever hear someone say deficits don't matter, I mean, really hardcore really think that printing money is just not a problem, it's these guys. Basic idea is did not like the idea of a gold standard, because what they wrote about was paper money, in the sense that government printing money and saying, this is the money, this is what you have to use. And as long as people use it, and the reason they will use it is because you're taxing them. So long as you tax them and say they have to use that money to pay their taxes, then there's going to be a demand for that pieces of paper. And as long as that's the case, you can print as much paper as you want to make sure that the government can spend all the money that it wants. And deficits aren't a problem. Instead, if inflation starts to become a problem, you just tax more, because then there'll be an increase in the demand for those pieces of paper to offset the increase in supply of those pieces of paper. So that's the basic idea of modern monetary theory. Okay, I'm not an expert in that field, but that should give you a sample of what people like G.F. Knapp here was saying. Now, first let's talk about the first round of Keynesians. You have Joan Robinson, one of the earliest developers of what is called post-Keynesian economics. She's also the mother of a field called feminist economics. A lot of her work is used by a lot of people who are focusing on developing economic ideas about the role of sort of women in the economy, and what reduces that role, increases that role, etc. She coined the term monopsony to describe a market with a single buyer. So instead of the term monopoly, which is a single seller, so if there's only one cell phone seller, they'll be able to raise the price. Well, then you have the opposite, a monopsony. If you only have a single buyer, they can force the price to be lower. Okay, because they're the only person who can buy from you. And she helped develop a lot of the long-run and growth theories based on the work of Keynes. So basically taking Keynes' work, which was mainly focused on sort of that how to get employment going on in the short run, and imposing those on more long-run theories. Then there was Piero Sraffa, okay, who critiqued the value theory back in the day. So again, remember, value theory was the main theory of back in the classical economists and Marx, that focused a lot on labor's contribution and the work put in and the value of it. And he critiqued that and also helped rethink a lot of the work of David Ricardo and created a school of economics called Neo-Ricardians. Okay, but he's mainly considered to be a post-Keynesian. Now, he was an early collaborator with Keynes in the general theory, but he withdrew because there was a lot of stuff in there that he didn't necessarily agree with Keynes on. But it was Keynes who really brought him to Cambridge, okay, because Keynes was impressed because he corresponded with Gramsci, who is a philosopher, and wanted him to have him around. Piero Sraffa also critiqued Hayek and his theory of the business cycle, basically critiquing the idea of the natural interest rate, saying that if there really was a natural interest rate, that there wouldn't just be one natural interest rate, that there would be many for different goods and services, etc. So in that case, how would you know if the government's necessarily pushing interest rates below every industry's natural interest rate? It may only be pushing it down below some, etc., etc., etc. Okay, but mainly for his rethinking of the work of Ricardo is what Piero Sraffa is mainly known for. Then there's Michael Kalecki, okay, and again, a lot of people like Michael Kalecki and Hyman Minsky, who I'll be mentioning later on. These people have suddenly made sort of resurgence in economic thought after the crisis among much more like sort of left-wing economists. But Michael Kalecki was very focused on the political process and how it affected economic calculation. He also did a lot of math to illustrate ideas of sort of income inequality and income distribution and stuff like that. And a lot of his ideas actually preceded Keynes in many ways. A lot of stuff that Keynes said, Michael Kalecki kind of said first. The problem is he was a Polish economist and he wrote in Polish, while Keynes wrote in English, which was a much more used language. So Keynes became much more associated. It's kind of like the difference between why Ludwig von Mises became not as famous as Hayek, because Hayek's work was translated much earlier than Ludwig von Mises' work. Okay. Cool. Then there's Hyman Minsky. Most of his work, this was an American economist, most of his work focused on financial instability and crisis. He basically theorized the economy would always be fluctuating between robustness, meaning very good strength, nothing can hurt it, and then something will change, and now it'll become unstable. So it would be fluctuating between robustness and instability. And mainly the reason this happened was because of debt. Okay, there'd be a huge accumulation of private debt, because what happened as debt begins to grow, it becomes more profitable to carry more debt, and private firms and private households will begin to carry more debt to buy things, and it will cause such an overhang of debt that the economy kind of hits sort of this gridlock period and has to hit this period where they have to pay that down, and that's sort of the period of instability. Okay, and that moment when you switch over from a very strong economy to that really weak debt-ridden economy is what's called a Minsky moment. Okay, when 2008 and the economy collapsed, a lot of people referred to that as a Minsky moment. And because of that, Minsky said, what the government needs to regulate the accumulation of debt. Make sure that private households and private industry doesn't ever accumulate too much debt, so you don't have these Minsky moments. Then there's Nicholas Kaldor. He developed all sorts of contributions to economics, like the Kaldor-Hicks efficiency model. It's basically Pareto efficiency light, which means that instead of saying the point where you can't make someone better off, so Pareto efficiency was the point where you can't make anyone better off without making someone worse off. Kaldor-Hicks efficiency is to the point where you can't make people better off more than you would make someone else worse off. Okay, so if you had to make someone else worse off, as long as you made everyone else better off more, it was still Kaldor-Hicks efficient. Okay, and he developed Kaldor's growth laws, which basically summarizes this as more manufacturing is good. Okay, developed circular cumulative causation. This is the idea that trying to mathematically model when one thing changes another, which causes a changing in something else, and then that causes a change in the original thing, and you just end up having this sort of cumulative effect of change. So in the sense of A doesn't just change B, but then because A changed B, it also changes C, which changes D, and then D changes A again. That kind of thing. Okay, and he worked with that with an economist named by Gunnar Myrdal, which, if I remember right, I think he won the Nobel Prize, Gunnar Myrdal, at the same time Hayek did. And he also coined the term convenience yield. This was referring to futures markets and the amount you would pay extra to buy something in the future, and the yield of it. Then there's Paul Davidson. He was the founder of the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics. And this is sort of the publication sort of defined who the post-Keynesians were. The people who wrote for that were, well, the post-Keynesians, who are considered the more closest to Keynes' original work of all the different schools of Keynesians. And there's three of them: Neo-Keynesians, New Keynesians, and Post-Keynesians. Okay, I think in this presentation I'll only mention the Post-Keynesians by name, even though I will go over some Neo-Keynesian and New Keynesians throughout the presentation. I just don't point them out, but I'll point them out if I remember which ones they were. Okay, and he's still a leading proponent of post-Keynesianism in America. He's still out there interviewing, teaching, etc. So he's still around. Then there's John Hicks. John Hicks developed the ISLM model, which is very heavily used in Keynesian macroeconomics to this day, which is sort of the investment minus savings divided by liquidity preference minus money supply. Okay, and you would create this curve where you'd have one line that represented investment and savings, and you'd have another line that represented liquidity preference and money supply, and you'd see where they would cross. Okay, it would also be referred to as a Keynesian cross. So if you ever heard a lecture by an economist named Roger Garrison, he always talks about Keynesian crosses and Hayekian triangles, referring to all these different curves and stuff. You can probably find that lecture by Roger Garrison somewhere on YouTube. So just look up Roger Garrison on YouTube. Okay, he also developed the theory of consumer demand theory, or he developed consumer demand theory in microeconomics, basically taking a lot of the demand macro ideas that Keynes put out and started looking at sort of micro changes of consumer demand and how to start creating micro foundations or micro level of ideas to explain why on the macro level things happen. Then there's institutional economics. Okay, and what institutional economics did is, instead of looking at like government policy and the overall economy, it started focusing on different institutions. Okay, and then at this point the term institution is being used very fuzzy. It's just kind of like abstractions that are part of society that sort of have an effect on how society works. Okay, so such as corporations, churches, schools, etc. And these economists would focus on these different institutions and focus more on them than focusing on government and private business in a more macroeconomic kind of way. Now, sort of the father of institutional economics was Thorstein Veblen, because he wrote a book called The Theory of the Leisure Class, and he also he coined the term conspicuous consumption. This is the idea that people buy stuff not because they need it or want it or whatever, but it's because they want to show it off. So people who buy really expensive cars to show off. Okay, and he said this was sort of a sign of inefficiency and proof that the economy is not necessarily always working efficient. And generally he was sort of against that kind of thing. He also wrote a theory of business enterprise, which discussed how business will, attempt to monopolize and expand credit for their own protection. So that way, the idea is if they owe more money, they're more likely to be protected by financial institutions. Also, they can borrow to grow faster than their competitors, so that way they have a stronger foothold on the market. And this will lead to expanding militarism and war for a variety of different reasons. Because some of these businesses will try to develop military contracts to get more market share. All those are different reasons. But the idea is, his argument was, if you allow this trend to just, or this circle to continue, you'll just end up in a war state. Then there's Adolf Berle. Okay, he's very fascinating in the sense that he's the first guy to really sit there and talk about how a corporation is structured and talk about the idea of corporate governance, saying, how a corporation works or how is it defined by the law has an effect on how well it serves the economy. Okay, and he would talk about a lot of reforms that should be made to corporations in order to make sure corporations don't become a parasite to the economy as a whole. This has become a whole field of academic research and discussing, if a CEO is paid this much, what are the incentives of the CEO and how does it change their behavior and their success rates, etc. If the board of directors has these abilities, if you structure securities in this way. Basically, the idea is, depending on how you structure the chain of command of a corporation, how do you end up with different levels of risk taking by the corporation or a lack of risk taking by the corporation, etc. Okay, and that all started with Adolf Berle. Then there's John Dewey. John Dewey was actually a philosopher, not an economist, but what is important here when it comes to institutional economics is his work on education. He was a big proponent of democracy and basically believed that only way a democracy can work is if people were more educated, because more educated people will mean they'll be more active politically, which will mean democracy can work better. If people were to get stupid, well, then democracy doesn't work. If you have a bunch of stupid people voting, you don't get the same sort of accountability. So he was very big on public education for the sake of trying to make sure that the average level of intelligence of the population was higher, so that way politicians would be held more accountable to the median intellect of people. Okay, which will lead to a less oppressive government, which is good for the economy and people as a whole. Okay, and a lot of that work would influence a lot of institutional economists. Then there's Clarence Ayers. He was developed what's known as the Texas School of Institutional Economics, and he didn't focus so much on institutions more than he focused on the role of technology. And you can kind of think of technology as an institution, but as I mentioned earlier, the idea that technology progressed faster than social change. So kind of how we talked about Bagehot talking about sort of social tensions caused by technology, Clarence Ayers really took that a step further and really talked about, it's technology that pushes society forward and really formalized that idea. John Kenneth Galbraith. Okay, this guy was a firebrand. Basically, his deal was that big business, that we don't live in a world where you have sort of small businesses that use the old economic ideas. You now have a world of big multinational corporations, and at this point, the consumer's no longer in the driver's seat. That corporations can now control through their massive amount of marketing dollars and political influence how can consumers behave, because they can put together enough marketing messages to get people to consume their goods, even if it's in their best interest, if they don't value it, and change their behavior, and also to prevent their competition by using government to protect themselves. Okay, so he started arguing for something called social democracy, where basically you start using government to limit the power of these big businesses more, so that way they can't. So these are things like, he would be a proponent of things like campaign finance reform, so corporations can't directly financially corrupt the political system. Also limitations on advertising and marketing, so that way the messages that are sent out to the average person are limited, so that way to limit the direct influence of corporations on how society works. And this is still a very, very popular idea in politics among the left, and he's still a major thought, even though, and his son James Kenneth Galbraith is still a major thought leader among sort of left-wing thinking. Okay, now that we've kind of gone through the history of economics, for the most part, and again, there's a lot of economists that I wish I could have spent more time on, some that I didn't even give a slide to because this presentation is probably going to end up being over an hour. But now we're going to go over modern economists who are working now. Some of them might have recently passed away, but who are working now that have important ideas and you should be aware of and probably check out their work. So you have Milton Friedman. He passed away in the 90s. he was a father of a school called monetarism, and basically the focus here is the money supply and how the money supply's effect on prices in the economy. Okay, and he was the founder of the monetarist school of economics. He was also one of the major libertarian thinkers of the 20th century, constantly promoting the ideas of liberty and sort of freedom and free markets and all that stuff. He was against central banks, but he was also against the gold standard. He basically wanted a world of floating exchange rates, where basically the values of a country's currency would be valued in markets for that currency. And as far as money supply growth, he wanted a rule-based money supply growth, so that way you didn't have people with political influence making decisions about money supply. That the money supply would grow at a set rate that would somehow be keyed into productivity. Then you had Robert Mundell, who's probably the father of what's called supply-side economics, okay, which really focuses on lower taxes. The idea being lower taxes equals more capital for investment, which will lead to more, and more investment leads to more businesses, which leads to more stuff, better prices, and also will lead to innovations and a progressive society. Mainly, in particular, the top tax rate. And the reason why supply-siders focus on the top tax rate is because the idea is that investment comes from capital, and that capital technically comes from savings, because the bank lends you out the money that people saved. And the people most likely to save are the richest people. If you were lower taxes on the poor people, per se, they're not going to save that money. They're probably going to spend it right away because they haven't necessarily bought everything they need this year. But if you lift taxes, let's say 1% on someone who's fabulously wealthy, they aren't really going to change their behavior that year. They probably bought what they were going to buy anyways. That extra money instead will just go be invested and go into the capital markets, which means it'll be used to help start more businesses. Okay, he also was a big proponent of optimal currency zones, so basically talking about how big a space and politically would you need for this would be best for just one single currency. And it was a lot of this work that led to the creation of the euro and the eurozone. Okay, and he also predicted before it actually happened, and this actually happened, that leaving the Bretton Woods system, which was a monetary system that we had sort of in the mid 20th century, that we went off during the Nixon era, that it would lead to stagflation. And stagflation just means high inflation and high unemployment at the same time. Okay. Art Laffer was probably the most popular supply-side economist. He was very famous under Reagan, and also very famous for creating something called the Laffer curve, which was a sort of an illustration saying that at 0% taxes, government will collect no revenue. At 100% tax rate, the government will collect no revenue because no one will work. So that means the ideal tax rate where the government will derive the most revenue has to be somewhere in between. And the point of making this observation was that they were making the argument at the time, because this is before Reagan was making the argument to lower taxes, so this is in the mid-80s, early 80s, that if you can lower the tax rate just a little bit more, the government could generate more revenue. Okay. Paul Krugman. Now we're getting into some of the more modern Keynesians. He was a Nobel Prize winner, New York Times columnist, probably the most well-known Keynesian today. Okay, and he recently wrote the book End This Depression Now. He's won prizes for a lot of his work on recessions and depressions, particularly like on the Japanese, what's referred to as the lost decade, and things like that. Then there's Joseph Stiglitz, also a Nobel Prize winner for his ideas of information asymmetries. This is the idea that when you're taking a look at perfect or thinking about economics in the abstract, we're always kind of assuming that everybody has access to information about their buying decisions. Okay, so we'll say, well, the person, if they knew, if they don't like this, then they just won't buy that. But what if they don't know that that's a problem? Okay, and if one person has more access to information than the other person, can they take advantage of that? And that's sort of the idea behind information asymmetries, where basically what Stiglitz was saying is that the government should get involved in trying to make sure there's more information available for people, so that way they're less likely to be taken advantage of because they can access that information. He worked under the Clinton administration, recently wrote the book The Price of Inequality. While I'm technically on the opposing point of view of Keynesians and whatnot personally, I did think that The Price of Inequality was actually a really good book, and I really enjoyed it, and he made some really thought-provoking arguments in that book. and I did videos on that and Paul Krugman's book, just going over the different chapters and my thoughts on them. So I would recommend reading the books, but you can also watch my videos as sort of a companion to reading the books. John Kenneth Galbraith. He's also a modern Keynesian. He's the son of John Kenneth Galbraith, but he's also a big proponent of modern monetary theory, what formerly was known as Chartism. Okay, and you'll hear him on TV talking about how basically government can spend as much money as it wants, and usually with my jaw dropped down to the ground. Okay, he's also a big proponent of actually lowering the retirement age. So while most economists are saying that it's time to make sure that the Social Security system doesn't go bankrupt, that we should raise the retirement age, he makes the opposite argument, making the argument that if you lower the retirement age, there will be more people who retire, which will free up demand for labor, because those people will need people to replace their jobs. And at the same time, more people spending the money from the Social Security would also create more buyers of stuff, and a new buyers, which will get the economy going. So his argument that lowering the retirement age would actually help more than it would hurt. Okay? And that even if there's deficits, he doesn't have to worry, because again, government can just print out as much money as it wants, as long as they tax enough. Basically the MMT point of view. Mark Thomas, another Keynesian. He's a fellow at the Century Foundation. He's an econometrician. He puts out all his classes, I think, on YouTube. I've watched him a couple of times, and you'll learn a lot of stuff. A lot of math stuff, so he shows you how the formulas work with monetary theory and stuff like that. He's a popular economic blogger, so he blogs all over the place. And again, you can check him out on YouTube. He's always posting on there. You can follow him on Twitter, always putting out interesting economic articles. But he's a fairly well-regarded Keynesian in the modern day. Steve Keen from Australia. He's an Australian post-Keynesian economist who's become sort of a very big figure among left-wing Keynesians. Basically what he's done is that he's taken a lot of the work of Hyman Minsky and Irving Fisher that we talked about earlier, and helped to try to combine that work into a theory of, sort of how debt creates business cycles and stuff like that. Okay, and he wrote a book called Debunking Economics, where he critiqued the neoclassical school of economics. Now, the neoclassical school, while I won't mention it directly throughout the presentation, is just basically what's considered mainstream economics nowadays. It's just basically classical economics, except you replace it's like Adam Smith, but you throw in all the stuff from the Marginal Revolution, some of the math stuff, the general equilibrium analysis stuff, and then you just kind of take the best of all worlds and with the assumption that all people are rational, and you get neoclassical economics. Okay? And people have different thoughts on that, and they'll go different ways on that. Murray Rothbard, one of my favorites. Murray Rothbard was an extremely prolific writer. This guy wrote a lot, especially since I think he died at like around 50. Okay? He died in 1995. But he made huge contributions to economics, history, philosophy, all over the place. He was the father of an idea called anarcho-capitalism. And this is the idea that there should be no government at all. There's nothing. He argued with the idea that there's public goods that the market will not provide. He would say, there's ways that the market can provide them. And he would make these arguments in his writings and his books, and get published in journals and whatnot. And was a huge firebrand for the most part, where there's sort of a whole branch of Austrian economics that's sort of built around him, especially characterized by a lot of the fellows over there at the Mises Institute, which he helped found with Lew Rockwell. Okay, if you're looking for an economist whose writing will sort of like light a fire under you and be like, man, that's some pretty hard-hitting work, Murray Rothbard's work is there. Okay, he's just sort of very in your face, and very willing to just make an argument and kind of go with it. So whether you're sympathetic to sort of less or more government, definitely read some of his work. It's quite a fascinating read. Israel Kirzner, okay, he contributed to the body of economic work through the ideas of building up on a lot of the ideas that Hayek made on knowledge, talking about how like prices communicate knowledge, and knowledge helps the economy coordinate. So you want a free market of prices, how entrepreneurs, so again going back to Schumpeter and Von Wieser, the ideas of entrepreneurship driving the economy and ethics, etc. Okay, and he was a leading authority on the work of Ludwig von Mises. So when people need to know like about Ludwig von Mises and what did he mean by things that he wrote in his work and stuff like that, they go to Israel Kirzner, since he studied under Mises for a very long time. Walter Block, another one of my favorites. Okay, another really in-your-face economist. Basically, he's really well known for writing really good economic work on why things that people think are bad are good. Okay, most famously for his book Defending the Undefendable, where he will describe things and why, like, the pimp is actually doing a favor to the economy, why the prostitute is doing a favor to the economy, why the gambler is doing a good thing for the economy, and all these different things. It's one of those books that really makes you really expand the way you look at economics. He also recently wrote The Case for Discrimination, okay, which I haven't read yet, but I'm definitely looking forward to reading it one of these days. He's made a lot of contribution. He's written a lot of published academic articles, so his contributions are many. But one of the more interesting ones is negative homesteading theory. This is the idea that something can be negatively homesteaded. So first, let's talk about what homesteading is. The idea is that most of us can kind of exemplify how do you transfer property from one person to the other, in the sense that if I have a computer and I say, here, my computer is now yours, that would be a just transfer of ownership of something. But what happens if something is not owned by somebody yet? How do you establish the first claim of ownership? And that's where homesteading theory comes in. That if you're the person who transforms something, it's yours first. So for example, if there's a bunch of land that's unclaimed, and I go in there and I build a fence, I've transformed the land, and the land that I've fenced in is my land. It's the land that I've transformed. I was the first person to do it. It's mine. Someone else can come transform it after me, but I did it first, so I still have the prior claim. Now, what Walter Block was saying with negative homesteading theory was, what if someone forced you to homestead something against your will, in the sense that, like, what if I treated you really badly? Okay, and you start developing negative feelings. Well, technically, those feelings you created. They're your feelings. They're your ownership. But I forced you to create them. And thus, I am doing something bad, and that's unethical and something that's not good. So bullying would be sort of an example of negative homesteading. Okay, so if someone were to bully you and cause you to be depressed or something like that, they would have negatively homesteaded those negative feelings. Robert P. Murphy, okay, a very young quick rising upstart in the Austrian community. He wrote a critique of Austrian time preference theory. I'm not quite as articulate about his argument on that yet, so I'll recommend that you read his dissertation. He's also written a lot of work on anarcho-capitalism and a lot of the work of Murray Rothbard. He's also written like study guides for the treatise by Murray Rothbard, which is Man, Economy, and State and Human Action by Ludwig von Mises. And he's also written a textbook for high school and introductory college called Lessons for the Young Economist. Joseph Salerno has done a lot of work on money. He's a teacher at Pace University. His most recent book is Money, Sound, and Unsound, and he's a fellow at the Mises Institute. Peter Klein, another one of my favorites. He does a lot of work on organizational economics and from an Austrian perspective. And I'm become a big fan of governance and organizational economics and institutional economics. Basically, getting out of the realm of government versus the people and getting more into how all these other things we deal with on a daily basis, the stories that we deal with, the religions that we deal with, the businesses that we deal with, the way they're structured, the rules that they set, the culture that they create. All these kind of things to me are extremely interesting, and Peter Klein works within that realm, so I find his work very interesting. He also runs the Organization and Markets blog with Nikolai Foss, online, so definitely check out that blog and subscribe to it if you don't. George Guido Hulsmann also written a lot of work on monetary issues. Most famous for his biography of Ludwig von Mises called The Last Night of Liberalism, just talking about the life and work of Ludwig von Mises. Is a very, very thick book. He also wrote The Ethics of Money Production, where he talked about the ethical issues with increasing the money supply and decreasing the money supply, and deflation and liberty, talking about how deflation can actually protect liberty and things like that. Okay, so very interesting work. Very interesting economist. Huerta de Soto, a leading Spanish economist, adjunct scholar for the Mises Institute. He's one of the member of the Mont Pelerin Society's board of directors. Remember, I mentioned them earlier. Ludwig von Mises was one of the founding members. He's also on the editorial board of the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. Now, if I remember right, I think he contributed the idea of, I want to say it's adaptive efficiency. Okay, and I don't remember exactly what that idea is. I think it has something to do with like free markets and institutions' ability to adapt. But it's not coming to me at the moment, so I apologize. But again, look up Puerto So, look up his work, look up the idea of adaptive efficiency, and you can clear all that up. Steve Horwitz, okay, another very popular Austrian, appears a lot on TV nowadays. Okay, he's contributed a lot of to monetary theory, history of economic thought, social theory of the family, talking about the role of a family in economic behavior and what happens when you don't have a very strong family, what happens when you have a weak family, a lot of work like that. He also participates in the blog Bleeding Heart Libertarians, which are sort of, it's a new movement of libertarians who do care more about sort of social issues like social tolerance, social justice, etc. They just want to solve those issues without using government force, etc. So he blogs for the Bleeding Heart Libertarians blog. Peter Boettke, another really fast rising star in the Austrian community. He wrote a book recently called Living Economics, which is more about how to make teaching economics exciting for the students and to get people excited about economics. A book that is definitely on my list of things I want to read. He also wrote another book with Paul Dragos called Institutional Analysis and Development. Basically, a lot of people like Peter Boettke, Lawrence White, Steve Selgin, they take a lot of the work of the institutional economists, or the new institutional economists like Douglas C. North and Ronald Coase, we'll talk about a little bit later on, and have mixed them a lot with Austrian ideas and have been really doing some fascinating work, in my opinion. Same thing with like Arnold Kling and Nicholas Schultz, etc. Okay, and he's a professor at George Mason University. Lawrence H. Wright, who I'm becoming a very big growing fan of. He does a lot of work and a big proponent of something called free banking. So I mentioned earlier, this is the idea that the banking system should just be free of government intervention, that banks should just be free to compete with each other, to succeed and fail against each other, and use the practices that they want within, of course, within sound property rights, etc. He wrote the book The Theory of Monetary Institutions. He wrote the book Free Banking in Britain, where he's done a lot of work on the history of free banking in Britain and the good and the bad. And recently he wrote the book The Clash of Economic Ideas, which talks about different economic debates in history and illustrates both sides. And it's a book that's a high on my to get to list. George Selgin, another proponent of free banking, has done research in private coinage in Britain, proponent of a productivity norm and monetary policy. Again, he's a free banker, so he's against central banks, against government involvement in banking in general. But in general, if you're going to have a central bank, he wants the money supply or the interest rate to have something to do with productivity and cause a predictable level of deflation. If I read it right. Okay, then there's Richard Wolff, who's probably not too far from where I am right now in the sense of physically, because he teaches at the New School in Manhattan, and I'm located right now in Staten Island, so not too far away from here. And basically he's started with his students a journal for Marxian economics called Rethinking Marx. Basically, he does a lot of work and taking a lot of those old Marxian ideas and taking a lot of the work since then in economics and reconciling all of it, and still basically making a argument against capitalism as Marx did back in the day. Daniel Kahneman, he was a psychologist and basically a founding father of the idea of the field of behavioral economics, where basically here you're taking a look at how people actually behave. You put them in situations where they have to make decisions, and you observe the behaviors. Sit there and say, well, we know what a quote-unquote rational person would do. What do people actually do when we put them into a situation? And what does the reality of it tell us about how we can help people make the quote-unquote rational decision? Okay. Again, when you're thinking rational, you're thinking, what would the person who had all the available information and somehow objectively know what's in their best self-interest would do? Okay, based on the information that is available, assuming they had access to all of it. Okay, that's probably the best way I can explain it. Okay, and he's also, again, he started this behavioral economics along with the likes of Richard Thaler and Amos Tversky. And he's done a lot of work on hedonic psychology, contributed a lot to psychology, behavioral sciences, etc. So he's contributed 20 times over. He's a very interesting fellow. I don't necessarily agree with certain assumptions, but his work is definitely absolutely fascinating and stuff that you should be familiar with. Like, for example, Richard Thaler recently wrote a book called Nudge with a guy by the name of Cass Sustein, which was actually a really good read. I recommend reading it. I did videos on that, giving my take on that book as well. Dan Ariely, he wrote the books Predictably Irrational, Upside of Irrationality, The Honest Truth of Dishonesty, and he works at Duke University. He's become sort of one of the leading faces of behavioral economics, mainly because he's a really funny guy. He's really good at taking a lot of these ideas and putting them in a way that's exciting. And I'm looking forward to, I have all 3 of his books, haven't read them yet, looking forward to it. I'll be putting out videos when I do read them, but he's definitely, you can see, he has probably one of the most watched TED Talks out there, and overall, just a very fascinating guy. Paul Zak, another book that I need to get to. As you can see, I have a huge, well, you can't see it, but I have a huge stack of books right behind me that I've been slowly working my way through, so I'll get through them. But he's a leading neuroeconomist. He pretty much created the field of neuroeconomics, which is the idea of taking a look at brain patterns, particularly the release of oxytocin and what it tells you about economic behavior. So the idea is that he puts people in economic situations, sees what happens with the release of oxytocin, and what does it do with the way they participate in economics. And he wrote a book recently that came out called The Moral Molecule, where he talks about the findings of his work. Ronald Coase, the dude's still alive. He's over 100 years old and still writing. This dude is hardcore. But he's developed, his work has developed the field of new institutional economics and also the field of law and economics. Okay. There's something called the Coase theorem, which Ronald Coase here is not a big fan of his own theorem. It's not really his theorem, they just called it that. What he was making a statement in an essay saying that in a world without transaction costs, that it wouldn't matter who you allocate property rights to. Things will sort of work themselves out the same way. Okay, but in the real world, transaction costs do exist. So, for example, if I'm a lender and you're the person borrowing from me, I probably have more access to information. It's probably easier for me to get information. The cost of getting information is probably less for me than it is for you. So in that case, it's not equal as we would sort of in an abstract economic sense. So in that case, when writing how a law should be upheld, that should be taken into consideration. And in the sense that you should distribute externalities and property rights to the party who has the least transactional cost in a sense. Okay, and I'm kind of going a little further with the theory than I or with what he said than I should, but that's basically get at, and that's sort of how the whole field of law and economics built up, in the sense how can you take laws and not just write laws, but how do you as a judge enforce a law, and how does the legal system affect economic behavior. And since law is considered an institution, this also was part of his work, was very instrumental in what became new institutional economics. Okay. Okay. Oh, and I realized I didn't change the text here for Ronald Coase. So here you still see the text for John Kenneth Galbraith. So I already told you who Ronald Coase is, but the text here, that's from John Kenneth Galbraith. So I apologize for that. Okay. Along with Douglas C. North, who's also one of the founding fathers of the new institutional economics. Okay, he helped develop clear metrics, which is a mathematical way of taking a look at historical information and looking at the history of economic trends and data to come up with new stories and narratives. He helped define what is an institution versus an organization. So to kind of illustrate this difference, an organization would be like the structure of power. So like the people who's in charge, who's below them, when do they report to them, how does the organization structure itself, how do the individuals working towards a common goal structure each other. But the effects of that, like the rules that they impose on people and whatnot, that'd be the institution. So, for example, if I'm a student at a university, the rules that the university imposes on me, the marketing and the culture that's created by that university, and the things that it represents, that's the institution. Okay, so the organization would be like the dean, whatnot, and how they're structured with each other to run the university, and the effect and the rules, and formal and informal, that are created by the university that affects the students' economic and social behavior, that would be the institution. And these are the kind of things that were studied in the new institutional economics, how those rules formally and informally get formed, how do they affect economic behavior, and going from there. And then there's James Buchanan, okay, from the he developed what's called public choice economics, which is the idea of looking at economics from a political point of view and saying politicians don't necessarily make the choices best for the people, but they have their own interests, and understanding how political organizations are formed and institutions are formed, and how it shapes each individual political actor's influence, particularly an idea called rent-seeking, where basically people seek to go to the political process to get profits that are not due to an increase in productivity or an increase in production of value, but just because of political favors. You have all sorts of weird manifestations in politics. So basically the idea is politics are corrupt. Okay, and public choice theory was a big tool in trying to make the argument that you don't want government making decisions. Why? Because the politicians don't really have the best incentives, and that's what public choice is looking at. What those incentives are, what makes them worse, what makes them better, etc. Okay, and I think that's where this ends. Yep. My name is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com. Check out my website, alexmerced.com, or check out libertarian101.com or learneconomicsnow.com to learn more. Please comment on this video. If there's other economists that you would like other people to be aware of, mention them in the comments. And hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and you guys have a great day and enjoy.